Volume 3, Part 4 of Herodotus' Histories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Tierney. Histories, Volume 3, by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Translated by E. D. Godley. Part 4. The men who served in the army were the following. The Persians were equipped in this way. They wore on their heads loose caps called tiaras, and on their bodies embroidered sleeved tunics, with scales of iron like the scales of fish in appearance, and trousers on their legs. For shields they had wicker bucklers, with quivers hanging beneath them. They carried short spears, long bows, and reed arrows, and daggers that hung from the girdle by the right thigh. Their commander was Otanes, son of Amestris, and father of Xerxes' wife. They were formerly called by the Greeks Cephanes, but by themselves and their neighbors Artai. When Perseus, son of Danae and Zeus, had come to Cepheus, son of Belus, and married his daughter Andromeda, a son was born to him whom he called Perses, and he left him there, for Cepheus had no male offspring. It was from this Perses that the Persians took their name. The Medes in the army were equipped like the Persians. Indeed, that fashion of armor is Median, not Persian. Their commander was Tigranes, an Achaemenid. The Medes were formerly called by everyone Aryans, but when the Colchian woman Medea came from Athens to the Aryans, they changed their name, like the Persians. This is the Medes' own account of themselves. The Scythians in the army were equipped like the Persians, but they wore turbans instead of caps. Their commander was Anaphis, son of Otanes. The Hyrcanians were armed like the Persians. Their leader was Megaponus, who was afterwards the governor of Babylon. The Assyrians in the army wore on their heads helmets of twisted bronze made in an outlandish fashion not easy to describe. They carried shields and spears and daggers of Egyptian fashion, and also wooden clubs studded with iron, and they wore linen breastplates. They are called by the Greeks Syrians, but the foreigners called them Assyrians. With them were the Chaldeans. Their commander was Ataspes, son of Artaches. The Bactrians in the army wore a headgear very similar to the Median, carrying their native reed bows and short spears. The Sakai, who were Scythians, had on their heads tall caps, erect and stiff and tapering to a point. They wore trousers and carried their native bows and daggers, and also axes which they call sagaris. These were Amirgian Scythians, but were called Sakai. That is the Persian name for all Scythians. The commander of the Bactrians and Sakai was Histaspes, son of Darius and Cyrus's daughter Atassa. The Indians wore garments of tree wool, and carried reed bows and iron-tipped reed arrows. Such was their equipment. They were appointed to march under the command of Pharnazathres, son of Artabates. The Aryans were equipped with Median bows, but in all else like the Bactrians. Their commander was Sisamnes, son of Hydarnes. The Parthians, Chorasmians, Sogdians, Gandharians, and Dadakai in the army had the same equipment as the Bactrians. The Parthians and Chorasmians had for their commander Artabazus, son of Pharnaces, the Sogdians Azanes, son of Artaius, the Gandharians and Dadakai Artiphius, son of Artabanus. The Caspians in the army wore cloaks and carried their native reed bows and short swords. Such was their equipment. Their leader was Ariomardus, brother of Artiphius. The Sarangai were conspicuous in their dyed garments and knee-high boots, carrying bows and Median spears. Their commander was Pharandates, son of Megabazus. The Pactiis wore cloaks and carried their native bows and daggers. Their commander was Artaeuntes, son of Ithamitris. The Utians and Mykians and Paracanians were equipped like the Pactiis. The Utians and Mykians had for their commander Arsamenes, son of Darius. The Paracanians, Syromitris, son of Oyabazus. The Arabians wore mantles girded up, and carried at their right side long bows curving backwards. The Ethiopians were wrapped in skins of leopards and lions, and carried bows made of palm wood strips, no less than 4 cubits long, and short arrows pointed not with iron, but with a sharpened stone that they used to carve seals. Furthermore, they had spears pointed with a gazelle's horn, sharpened like a lance, and also studded clubs. When they went into battle, they painted half their bodies with gypsum, and the other half with vermilion. The Arabians and the Ethiopians who dwell above Egypt had as commander Arsames, the son of Darius and Artistone, daughter of Cyrus, whom Darius loved best of his wives. He had an image made of her of hammered gold. The Ethiopians above Egypt and the Arabians had Arsames for commander, while the Ethiopians of the east, for there were two kinds of them in the army, served with the Indians. They were not different in appearance from the others, only in speech and hair. The Ethiopians from the east are straight-haired, but the ones from Libya have the woolliest hair of all men. These Ethiopians of Asia were for the most part armed like the Indians, but they wore on their heads the skins of horses' foreheads, stripped from the head with ears and mane. The mane served them for a crest, and they wore the horses' ears stiff and upright. For shields they had bucklers of the skin of cranes. The Libyans came in leather garments, using javelins of burnt wood. Their commander was Massages, son of Orizus. The Paphlagonians in the army had woven helmets on their heads, and small shields and short spears, and also javelins and daggers. They wore their native shoes that reached midway to the knee. The Ligyes and Matieni and Mariandini and Syrians were equipped like the Paphlagonians. These Syrians are called by the Persians Cappadocians. Dotus, son of Megasidrus, was commander of the Paphlagonians and Matieni, Gobryas, son of Darius and Artistone, of the Mariandini and Ligyes and Syrians. The Phrygian equipment was very similar to the Paphlagonian, with only a small difference. As the Macedonians say, these Phrygians were called Briges as long as they dwelt in Europe, where they were neighbors of the Macedonians. But when they changed their home to Asia, they changed their name also and were called Phrygians. The Armenians, who were settlers from Phrygia, were armed like the Phrygians. Both these together had as their commander Artachmes, who had married a daughter of Darius. The Lydian armor was most similar to the Greek. The Lydians were formerly called Maones, until they changed their name and were called after Lydus, son of Attis. The Mysians wore on their heads their native helmets, carrying small shields and javelins of burnt wood. They are settlers from Lydia, and are called Olympieni after the mountain Olympus. The commander of the Lydians and Mysians was that Artaphernes, son of Artaphernes, who attacked Marathon with Datis. The Thracians in the army wore fox-skin caps on their heads, and tunics on their bodies. Over these they wore embroidered mantles. They had shoes of fawn-skin on their feet and legs. They also had javelins and little shields and daggers. They took the name of Bithynians after they crossed over to Asia. Before that they were called, as they themselves say, Stremonians, since they lived by the Stremon. They say that they were driven from their homes by Teucrians and Mysians. The commander of the Thracians of Asia was Basaces, son of Artabanus. The Pisidians had little shields of raw oxhide. Each man carried 2 wolf hunters' spears. They wore helmets of bronze, and on these helmets were the ears and horns of oxen wrought in bronze, and also crests. Their legs were wrapped around with strips of purple rags. Among these men is a place of divination sacred to Ares. The Cabales, who were Maones and are called Lasonii, had the same equipment as the Cilicians. When I come in my narrative to the place of the Cilicians, I will then declare what it was. The Milii had short spears and garments fastened by brooches. Some of them carried Lycian bows and wore caps of skin on their heads. The commander of all these was Badres, son of Histanes. The Masci wore wooden helmets on their heads, and carried shields and small spears with long points. The Tibareni and Macrones and Masanoiki in the army were equipped like the Masci. The commanders who marshaled them were, for the Masci and Tibareni, Ariomardus, son of Darius and Parmus, the daughter of Cyrus's son Smerdis. For the Macrones and Masanoiki, Arteuctes, son of Kerasmus, who was governor of Cestus on the Hellespont. The Mares wore on their heads their native woven helmets, and carried javelins and small hide shields. The Colchians had wooden helmets and small shields of raw oxhide and short spears, and also swords. The commander of the Mares and Colchians was Pharandates, son of Tiospis. The Alarodians and Saspiris in the army were armed like the Colchians. Massicistius, son of Syrometris, was their commander. The island tribes that came from the Red Sea, and from the islands where the king settles those who are called exiles, wore dress and armor very similar to the Median. The commander of these islanders was Mardontes, son of Bagaius, who in the next year was general at Mycale and died in the battle. These are the nations that marched by the mainland and had their places in the infantry. The commanders of this army were those whom I have mentioned, and they were the ones who marshaled and numbered them and appointed captains of thousands and 10,000s. The captains of 10,000s appointed the captains of hundreds and of tens. There were others who were leaders of companies and nations. These were the commanders, as I have said. The generals of these, and of the whole infantry, were Mardonius son of Gobrius, Titontachmes son of that Artabanus who delivered the opinion that there should be no expedition against Hellas, Smerdomenes son of Otanes. These two latter were sons of Darius's brothers, and thus they were Xerxes's cousins. Mesistes son of Darius and Atassa, Gergis son of Ariazus, and Megabyzus son of Zopyrus. These were the generals of the whole infantry, except the 10,000. Hydarnes son of Hydarnes was general of these picked 10,000 Persians, who were called immortals for this reason. When any one of them was forced to fall out of the number by death or sickness, another was chosen, so that they were never more or fewer than 10,000. The Persians showed the richest adornment of all, and they were the best men in the army. Their equipment was such as I have said. Beyond this they stood out by the abundance of gold that they had. They also brought carriages bearing concubines and many well-equipped servants. Camels and beasts of burden carried food for them, apart from the rest of the army. There are horsemen in these nations, but not all of them furnished cavalry. Only the following did so. The Persians, equipped like their infantry, except that some of them wore headgear of hammered bronze and iron. There are also certain nomads called Sagartian. They are Persian in speech, and the fashion of their equipment is somewhat between the Persian and the Pactian. They furnished 8,000 horsemen. It is their custom to carry no armor of bronze or iron, except only daggers, and to use ropes of twisted leather. They go to battle relying on these. This is the manner of fighting of these men. When they are at close quarters with their enemy, they throw their ropes, which have a noose at the end. Whatever he catches, horse or man, each man drags to himself, and the enemy is entangled in the coils and slain. Such is their manner of fighting. They were marshaled with the Persians. The Median cavalry were equipped like their infantry, and the Scythians similarly. The Indians were armed in the same manner as their infantry. They rode swift horses and drove chariots drawn by horses on wild asses. The Bactrians were equipped as were their foot, and the Caspians in the same manner. The Libyans, too, were armed like the men of their infantry, and all of them also drove chariots. In the same manner the Caspians and Paracanians were armed as the men of their infantry. The Arabians had the same equipment as the men of their infantry, and all of them rode on camels no less swift than horses. These nations alone were on horseback. The number of the horsemen was shown to be 80,000, besides the camels and the chariots. All the rest of the horsemen were ranked with their companies, but the Arabians were posted last. Since horses cannot endure camels, their place was in the rear, so that the horses would not be frightened. The captains of cavalry were Harmamithres and Tithæus, sons of Datis. The third, who was captain with them, Pharnuches, had been left behind sick at Sardis. As they set forth from Sardis, an unwelcome mishap befell him. A dog ran under the feet of the horse he was riding, and the horse was taken by surprise and frightened, so it reared up and threw Pharnuches. After his fall he vomited blood and began to waste away. The horse was immediately dealt with, according to Pharnuches' command. His servants led it away to the place where it had thrown their master, and cut off its legs at the knee. Thus it was that Pharnuches lost his command. The number of the triremes was 1,207, and they were furnished by the following. The Phoenicians with the Syrians of Palestine furnished 300. For their equipment, they had on their heads helmets very close to the Greek in style. They wore linen breastplates, and carried shields without rims, and javelins. These Phoenicians formerly dwelt, as they themselves say, by the Red Sea. They crossed from there, and now inhabit the sea-coast of Syria. This part of Syria, as far as Egypt, is all called Palestine. The Egyptians furnished 200 ships. They wore woven helmets and carried hollow shields with broad rims, and spears for sea warfare, and great battle axes. Most of them wore cuirasses and carried long swords. Such was their armor. The Cyprians furnished 150 ships. For their equipment, their princes wore turbans wrapped around their heads, and the people wore tunics. But in all else they were like the Greeks. These are their tribes. Some are from Salamis and Athens, some from Arcadia, some from Kythnos, some from Phoenice, and some from Ethiopia, as the Cyprians themselves say. The Cilicians furnished 100 ships. They also wore on their heads their native helmets, carried bucklers of raw oxhide for shields, and were clad in woolen tunics. Each had 2 javelins and a sword very close in style to the knives of Egypt. These Cilicians were formerly called Hippocaei, and took their name from Cilix son of Agenor, a Phoenician. The Pamphylians furnished 100 ships. They were armed like the Greeks. These Pamphylians are descended from the Trojans of the diaspora, who followed Amphilochus and Calchas. The Lycians furnished 50 ships. They wore cuirasses and greaves, and carried cornel wood bows and unfeathered arrows and javelins. Goat skins hung from their shoulders, and they wore on their heads caps crowned with feathers. They also had daggers and scimitars. The Lycians are from Crete, and were once called Thermalae. They took their name from Lycus son of Pandion, an Athenian. The Dorians of Asia furnished 30 ships. Their armor was Greek. They are of Peloponnesian descent. The Carians furnished 70 ships. They had scimitars and daggers, but the rest of their equipment was Greek. I have said in the beginning of my history what they were formerly called. The Ionians furnished 100 ships. Their equipment was like the Greek. These Ionians, as long as they were in the Peloponnese, dwelt in what is now called Achaia, and before Danaus and Xuthus came to the Peloponnese, as the Greeks say, they were called Aegialian Pelasgians. They were named Ionians after Ion, the son of Xuthus. The islanders provided 17 ships, and were armed like the Greeks. They were also of Pelasgian stock, which was later called Ionian for the same reason as were the Ionians of the 12 cities, who came from Athens. The Aeolians furnished 60 ships, and were equipped like Greeks. Formerly they were called Pelasgian, as the Greek story goes. Of the people of the Hellespont, the people of Abydos had been charged by the king to remain at home and guard the bridges. The rest of the people from Pontus, who came with the army, furnished 100 ships, and were equipped like Greeks. They were settlers from the Ionians and Dorians. Persians and Medes and Sakai served as soldiers on all the ships. The most seaworthy ships were furnished by the Phoenicians, and among them by the Sidonians. All of these, as with those who are marshaled in the infantry, each had their native leaders, whose names I do not record, since it is not necessary for the purpose of my history. The leaders of each nation are not worthy of mention, and every city of each nation had a leader of its own. These came not as generals, but as slaves, like the rest of the expedition. I have already said who were the generals of supreme authority and the Persian commanders of each nation. The admirals of the navy were Ariabignes son of Darius, Prixaspes son of Aspathines, Megabasus son of Megabates, and Achaemenes son of Darius. Ariabignes son of Darius and Gobrias's daughter was admiral of the Ionian and Carian fleet. The admiral of the Egyptians was Achaemenes, full brother of Xerxes, and the 2 others were admirals of the rest. The ships of 30 and of 50 oars, the light galleys, and the great transports for horses came to a total of 3,000 altogether. After the admirals, the most famous of those on board were these: from Sidon, Tetramnestus son of Anisus; from Tyre, Maten son of Siromus; from Aradus, Merbalus son of Agbulus; from Cilicia, Cyanesus son of Euromedon; from Lycia, Kyberniscus son of Sicas; from Cyprus, Gorgas son of Chersus, and Timonax son of Timagoras; and from Caria, Histiaios son of Timnes, Pigres son of Hiseldamus, and Damasithymos son of Candaules. I see no need to mention any of the other captains, except Artemisia. I find it a great marvel that a woman went on the expedition against Hellas. After her husband died, she took over his tyranny, although she had a young son, and followed the army from youthful spirits and manliness, under no compulsion. Artemisia was her name, and she was the daughter of Lygdamus. On her father's side she was of Halicarnassian lineage, and on her mother's, Cretan. She was the leader of the men of Halicarnassus and Cos and Nisyrus and Calydnos, and provided 5 ships. Her ships were reputed to be the best in the whole fleet after the ships of Sidon, and she gave the king the best advice of all his allies. The cities that I said she was the leader of are all of Dorian stock, as I can show, since the Halicarnassians are from Troezen, and the rest are from Epidaurus. End of Volume 3, Part 4. Recording by Jason Tierney.